Hello and welcome to the Sales Leader series. I'm your host, Freddie, where I'll be gathering B2B SaaS sales leaders from across the world to answer 5 short, topical B2B SaaS sales questions. These questions are going to be the same each week, bar one, giving you insight and different perspectives into how top performers within the industry think, as well as actionable advice you guys can use in your own selling careers. On this week's episode of the Sales Leader series, I'm chatting with Craig Sciglimpaglia. Craig has over 25 years of experience as a sales professional, leader, and mentor. Across that tenure, Craig has developed the skill set for selling complex enterprise AI SaaS solutions to C-suite and has worked with large global brands like Allianz, Best Buy, JetBlue, MetLife, Four Seasons, and more, just to name a few. Today, Craig is the VP of Sales at Quantified, an AI-powered role-play tool that drives sales results and turns B players into A players using AI, behavioral science, and data. Since 2012, they've been applying the latest in computational and social science to turn potential into performance. Craig, bit of a mouthful. Really appreciate you taking the time to chat.
It's good to see you. Good to meet you. And by the way, excellent pronunciation of the last name. That's one of the biggest challenges for me in sales, having that kind of last name, having to say that on a call or type it in an email. So I appreciate it.
Well, hey, look, for those listening, I'd have to hold my hands up. I double check that with Craig at least 5 times when we start recording. But I appreciate the shout out, Craig. I appreciate the shout out. All the places I think we could start this conversation, the multiple things that I wanted to ask you, Craig, is, I mean, over, say, the last year, and I think this is probably the best place to start, a lot of SaaS and B2B SaaS have experienced quite a difficult period of time. I mean, probably started, say, a year, 2 years ago now, with less money circulating around, larger purchasing teams because of that budget scrutiny and less availability to kind of use some of those funds, leading to longer sales cycles and just difficulty in buying software in general. I'm curious, as you joined Quantified just before the new year, what are you and the team doing to kind of address this at Quantified?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you're 100% right. I have tons of friends at different software companies. Unfortunately, a lot of them have gotten laid off. A number of them have gotten laid off or having to lay people off. And, sales are taking a lot. They're getting stalled. They're taking a lot longer. They're just falling out of pipeline. For us, we're still very much in startup mode, even though the company's been around for a very long time. We developed simulation software and we released it about a year ago. So it's kind of like a startup within a startup, or restarting again. And with that, in a way, what it's doing is it allows sales reps to practice the type of conversations or any customer facing rep type of conversation they're going to have on a daily basis, and replicating their buyer persona. That leads to more practice, better feedback leads to ultimately ROI. So driving more revenue, decreasing sales cycles and creating better pipeline. So I can't say we're protected from that. And also it's a shiny new object because we're talking about simulation software and AI, but that's helped somewhat. And I think the other thing is, we made a lot of changes. I would call them mistakes, but they're not mistakes. We're still trying to identify our true ICP of the industry and what use case we fit best in. But I think one of the biggest learnings for me this past year is something different than I typically would do with myself and the guys who work for me. Let's start people where we can start with them, with what our product can do. We were selling this grand vision 6 months, a year down the road, and that became problematic for a variety of reasons. And when we scaled that back to, okay, these are the problems we could solve today. And these problems mean something to you because it equals this. And then really being prescriptive about that, finding something that has a definite timeline, can be measured, we can generate ROI. That has actually led to a few shorter sales cycles and more streamlined because, look, let's face it, as you know, there's 3 ways to get a deal done quickly. Number 1, you have to know somebody who's willing to go out on a limb for you, which is rare. Number 2, there's a pricing or some type of terms incentive that they want. Or number 3, they have a compelling event. That's the best case scenarios. They have something you need to do by a timeline. If we don't have any one of those, we're in trouble. But I think, prescriptive and finding 2 out of those 3 has been helpful.
And when you think about those 3 different factors, especially with your team, and I can imagine the sales training is a massive element of this. Is it how are you qualifying those specific opportunities, especially when it's quite hard to find that out early on? I mean, is there any kind of best practices that you've used within your team to kind of get really rigorous on that process itself?
I mean, I think it's a mix of like the standard qualification methodology. So I'm sure you probably use versions of it, right? Where everyone has BANT, there's NOTE, there's the Challenger one. There's a bunch of different ones, which, you got to get to somebody who's got some level of authority. And we all know what that is. So I don't have to go through all that. But I think the key element here, as I'm sure I'm curious if you're facing this too, is that when you have a new technology that is disruptive to some degree, it's changing the way people do things in their process. And it's also really sexy and cool. It's really finding, does this person really have a problem they want to solve? And do they want to solve it with us quickly or eventually? Because otherwise it could be a lot of like, we just want to check this out. We want to see what this is. We heard it was interesting. It's AI, it's simulation. So finding that and finding the key people, just sales 101 has been really the way to go about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think with anything like that, that it's tapping into a new side of just a new way of doing, or you upskilling a team with new tech. You're always going to have to go through that process, and it's education, right? And that's the biggest thing. It's just finding those ways in which you can get those buyers to experience the product, yet it working out for both parties. So I think that's the difficulty.
But the biggest thing, and again, people listening will say, "Oh, Craig, we learned that week one. We learned this week one." But I'm going to, as a leader, I've got to repeat this for myself. Is the thing that's gotten us away from that is, again, sales 101, find the business challenge. The thing that matters to the business, is it helping them make money, save money, or avoid some legal action? Are they driving revenue? Are they reducing costs or time or whatever it is? And then bring that down to the process and the people we're talking to. So how does that change your process and impact that? When we're able to get to that, I think it's true almost any sales cycle, then we're able to get momentum.
Yeah, completely agree. Thinking about turning B players into A players, and if this does exist, right? I mean, I don't think this does. I don't entire team of A players, right? But if it does, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to find and upskill the team. And I think one of the reasons, and correct me if you disagree on this, is that sales managers have conflicting responsibilities, right? Time with their team versus what they're actually getting marks on, right? What is, in your opinion, an 80-20 change that sales leaders can make today to help better their team and their sellers that leaders often overlook?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question. I don't know. I honestly don't have a really good answer. I'm not sure what we overlook. I mean, I've never come across a team of completely A players. And, if I'm being 100% honest, there've been many times where I was not an A player in the same job. I performed really well, but I ran my mouth too much. I was impatient, or I was whatever it is. We all make a lot of mistakes in our career. So, and that you're pointing the biggest challenge in sales as a leader. And even as someone in a sales team, it's like, we know the top 20 are carrying the number. They're fine, right? They're going to be motivated. They're going to do what they have to do. The bottom 20 are potentially they're going to leave the company because they're not going to be successful, or they're going to be managed out. It's really that middle 60s, the math. Yeah, my math is right. So the middle 60, what do we do with the middle 60? I mean, some simple things that we've tried to do here at Quantified is obviously use metrics and stuff, but leverage technology that assesses. We're getting into this now, and I've used it at other companies where I was against it for a long time because I'm an old school salesperson. I started with can't believe I'm saying this. I started with an actual Rolodex and a phone book, and was just picking up the phone manually. Probably a little before your time. But, as the more I embrace leveraging technology that assesses a person's strengths and opportunities for improvement, and that frees up bandwidth so I can actually coach and say, let's work on this. This will improve you here. And actually, let's look at the recording, look what you're saying, and be transparent about your performance, and be willing. We all have to be willing, to change and take the hardest thing for any salesperson, and speak for myself. And we all have very big egos that are very fragile at the same time. It's to take really constructive feedback. It's not always constructive. But the last thing I'll say is, look, the hardest thing that I've found is finding someone's motivation and then being able to fuel that, because it's like in life, right? It's like in any relationship. having the sensitivity and the spontaneity to respond, be in a relationship with that person in the moment, and then be able to step back and let them do what they need to do.
And it's a part of, say, a sales manager's role. I think is somewhat neglected, like we mentioned at the start of that question, where in which that they have conflicting responsibilities, right? They're responsible for their own deals, they're responsible for the numbers, yet they still are responsible for their team. And part of that is the training of time to have that spontaneity to sit down with the salespeople and be like, right, what's going on? Where can I support for those motivating factors? I think, and it's interesting. I had a really good conversation with the CEO and founder of Insight Revenue, actually on this podcast last week, Zachary Gropper, and he mentioned, and he put it to me like this. He said, that top 20%, you're never ever going to replicate that. I mean, they've just got something, they got the gold dust, whatever it is, right? It's super hard. But finding those repeatable practices, those small things that you can emulate within that bottom 80% is going to make the biggest difference. I think that is, it's easier said than done, but I can imagine Quantified helps that, just because it is relieving time from sales managers, is making this more efficient.
Yeah, and it's also making it somewhat of anonymous practice up until a certain point, so you can do it in the privacy of your own home. You're talking about Quantified. You could practice the conversation, discovery call, initial pitch, presentation, price negotiation, things that, I might have been doing for 25, 30 years, but I still need to get better at. And I could do it in the privacy of my own home, make a mistake, and then go back and watch it, adjust, tweak it, and then, evolve. The other thing, and I'll try not to make this a long story at all, that I think is helpful, and I think it gets overlooked, is the relationship to a manager is, depending on the person. For me, that was actually the turning point. When I look at the times that I've been very successful as a individual contributor and as a leader, but if I'm speaking more to individual contributors, times when I was struggling, other times I was doing very, very well, it had something to do with a leader that I trusted. And I remember specifically, I learned more in 1 year from a couple companies back. I took a job as a regional sales manager. And I learned more from my boss in that company in 1 year than I learned in 10 years of my career. And it was by the way she did things, by the way she didn't do things, and her whole approach and her attitude, and really her approach to the art of sales, because it really is an art. So I think that is sometimes an overlooked factor, that the relationship between the rep and the manager is very, very vital.
I'm thinking about, and I'm curious, and you can be as specific as you like on this question, but I think it's a perfect segue. Looking back into all of those different roles that you have had over the last 25 years, and as I mentioned, be as specific as you like with this. What has been, and this is the question that we ask everyone that we get on this podcast, what has been one of the toughest moments in your career, if you had to choose one, and how would you advise others on dealing with something similar, not necessarily to help them avoid it, but to better deal with it?
God, I could think of a couple as an individual contributor and as a leader. I'll give you three. I'll try to make them very short. The very first one that came to mind, which is not one that I was thinking about, was one time I got fired because I had a big mouth. I was somewhat right about the things that I was saying, but I was 100% wrong in the way I was going about it, because I was doing well at the company. I had come from a competitor, so I knew the market industry, and I didn't really trust my boss. And I didn't think, let's just say he or she didn't know what she was doing. And I thought I knew more than he or she, and I knew more about the industry, the company, the product. And it was a big learning lesson for me that whether I'm right or wrong about something, I still report to someone. I'm still part of a company. And that might not mean as much in this day and age, because that's shifting, but there is a structure there. And if I can work within that structure, because that's what I chose. And if I'm going to be an entrepreneur, start my own company, that's different. I report to my board or my investors. But if I'm part of a team and part of the company, then that, to learn to work within that structure, but I couldn't, and I didn't, and I got fired because of it. So I would say, number one, if you're like me and you see yourself in that situation, do everything you can to just take a day. I had a very good friend who would try to level set me, find someone who could talk it out, whatever, find a way to keep your mouth sealed and be good. First thing I would say. The second one was the first time I had to let somebody go. It was when I was like 26 or 27, I became the director of a call center. It was a very large call center. We had a lot of folks coming in and out, and I had to fire somebody. And it was a tough point in my career. I remember sitting across the table, and I remember saying, he was the guy was trying to negotiate me. And I said, look, whatever you're saying, the outcome of this conversation is you're leaving here no longer an employee of this company. And I remember looking at him, and I remember the look in his face, and I remember feeling that ultimately I'm responsible for that. I was right that we needed to be fired. But I said, I'm also responsible for the company and the team. But it was a hard thing. Then I had to lay a bunch of other people up. And it was a hard thing to do when you're a young manager and you're first learning how to do that. So those are two things. The other thing, the last thing I'll mention, if anybody's going through this, several years back, I wanted to make a career transition. I had been selling a certain type of product or solution to a certain type of industry. I'll leave it at that. I can go into it some other time, but I wanted to move to another level, and I wanted to move out to a different type of selling. And I had some money saved because I'd done well that year, and I had some other investments, so I could take some time off. But I took some time off, and as the money started dwindling, I started to have to recalibrate. Like, I actually need to take a job, but I actually held out and was able to find something that transported me or transformed me into a different level of sales and in my career and in my life, and the way I thought about myself and the way I thought about my life in a career. So if you're going through a transition at that point, obviously be responsible financially, but, do the best you can to get support to not make a decision based on fear and revert back into a comfort zone. I was fortunate. I had a lot of people around me that helped me stay within that uncomfortableness. It was practical. I mean, they were like, don't be irresponsible financially to yourself and to your family, but take this chance, take this, because you'll find that you'll be in a different position.
It brings back memories of another conversation I had actually on this podcast of, because the head of sales at Occupy, a guy called Jacob Walker, and he was telling me the one way he puts it is having that network of people as like a personal board of directors, right? So not only as a sales leader, you can have some people to lean on in those difficult times, but also friends and family to keep you, push you into that tough spot where stick with it. You need to be uncomfortable. Otherwise, if you're comfortable, something's not right.
Think of your job. I'm sure on a daily basis, our world is tough. Sales is a very hard thing. It teaches us. For me, it taught me a lot about life. The ups and downs, it's always going to go up, and it's always going to go down, right? So I'm sure on a daily basis, it's like we need people to bounce things off of to help us create equilibrium in our internal experience, so then we can act strategically externally.
Completely agree. Taking a bit of a turn here, Craig. So obviously Quantified is heavily focused on AI, and obviously a bit of a buzzword over the last year. I mean, massive interest in kind of AI, especially early on in the year with ChatGPT being released to the public. Other than Quantified, I'm curious, are you using or are you kind of encouraging the team to use any AI tools? If so, what are they and how are you kind of use them?
Yes. Well, yes and no. So unfortunately, we're not using a lot right now. We are in the process of, exploring a couple platforms that like fire and pit platforms and different versions of them. They're not called CRMs anymore. I don't know what we're calling now, but different versions that bring all the information together, and then the AI will make sense of the information and create structure out of unstructured data that's actionable, right? So we're exploring that. Our marketing consultant uses some. I don't know exactly what he uses, unfortunately. Our BDR does use some AI, but more ML within a outreach campaign program that tells him, here's metrics around your calls, and here's what's landing, if it's not here are call times. Those are really the only ones we're currently using. But I do. So myself and Noah, our CEO, and our VP of Customer Success, the three of us have explored a number of options, and we do believe there's a tremendous value, especially at this stage when, there's one of me and a couple of people working for me, and we have a very small team, probably like you guys as well. And it would be helpful to have something that really augments our intelligence. Certainly something that augments our intelligence.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, we've had a similar experience in just playing around with certain tools, within our own tool as well. But I think there's, for the majority out there, I still think it's so early to tell where the most valuable parts of using AI is going to be. Personally, I don't think we're there yet, right?
But actually, so I was looking at your platform last time I spoke, and I thought the interesting thing, just so anybody that's listening, they should check it out, because what I really loved about it is it does do a lot of the things a lot of platforms can do. However, it goes beyond that. Like the fact that customers can be involved in that process. It makes their buying process a lot easier and smoother and transparent. I think I think that is a pain point on the customer's end that we're not aware of, the buying process and the way our sales is drastically transitioning to something much different than it used to be. Customers are much more educated. They have less time for like 2-hour discovery calls, right? It's just a totally different landscape. So making that process easier and more transparent for them, I think that's a really, really valuable thing you guys are doing.
And I also do think, I think we've seen this, especially over the last year. I think with the difficulty of sales teams in general selling into different buying teams, with the fact that there is obviously less budget. So more of those conversations and more of that trust building has to occur. And say, there's less time for those buyers to really dive deep into some of these platforms because they've got other responsibilities. They're worried about other things. And it does compound, and having that transparency and place to really make their lives easier is one of the biggest benefits we've seen over the last year for sales teams, rather than say the benefits for your own sales team, which obviously there will be, for both. But, it's interesting. I also do think, like you said there, I mean, B2B selling has been in a transition for the last, I think, 2 years, in that people aren't stupid.
Right.
You can't, they are so well informed about everything that's out there. Despite this, they still don't necessarily know how to buy software because it's not their day-to-day job, but they can find information. It's all about, why should we be doing business with you versus X, right? And so much of that, as we know as salespeople, is people, right? It's the experience. It's like, what is it like to do business with us? And this is the first touch or first experience someone has to go through that with them.
It's a good point. It's like, I'd be curious to hear, I know you probably be curious to hear how you guys are doing that, like how you develop. I think you're 100% right that some level of trust itself, not some level, trust itself is probably the most primary thing at this point. They don't have to like us in some ways. A lot of times they probably don't like half the salespeople they're working with. And let's face it, I know a lot of salespeople I wouldn't want to have a conversation with, let alone buy something from. But trusting someone, trusting that they're giving you transparent, accurate information, and that they are trying to find a solution that matches and it's going to solve a real world problem for them. I think you're 100% accurate on that. And the other thing is, last thing, not for you to tag on to trust, and for us as salespeople, transparency is a challenging thing because we can't be transparent about everything. We can't show exactly every ingredient in the sausage because it would be detrimental for the person trying to buy the software. But there's a different level of transparency that where it's actually helpful for the customer rather than hurting their buying process.
This is the last question, Craig, that I had for you. This is actually a question that I can't take credit for. It was a question that was given to us early on in the series from the CEO of Carabiner Group. So they're a consulting kind of advisory firm, but specifically for RevOps. And I think sales coaching and sales training really ties into RevOps. I'd be curious to kind of get your opinion on this. But how do you see sales training and enablement fitting into RevOps strategy for an organization, particularly in the way that they adopt and embrace technology like Quantified?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So when who do you initially reach out to? Like, who are you working with initially when you're talking to folks at companies?
For us, it's multi-tiered depending on the business. Ultimately, look, we're always trying to get executive sponsors on, but it's mainly the sales leaders that we go into. But depending on the size, I mean, we know that we have to build that trust in different areas with the entirety of that team. And that includes users, that includes buyers, that includes all of those different roles that we've identified. And that's kind of where we focus, but obviously depending on the size.
Yeah, the reason why I asked that is because I think you actually started answering my question. So we started with sales leaders. We thought we go directly to sales leaders. They're the ones that own the number, they own the revenue. They're going to want it. But what we found is that, and I guess it depends on the company because every company is different in the way they define. Some have RevOps, some don't. Some have sales trainings. They're all different titles. But essentially, what we found is that going to the sales enablement and sales training folks are the ones actually implementing the process on a daily basis, the ones that are going to adopt platforms that ultimately help support and drive what the sales leaders are doing and what the RevOps people are tracking. And what the RevOps people are tracking in terms of processes and improvements and efficiencies and driving revenue. Doing it that way has been an entry point. And I've seen that those departments are becoming closer aligned. Used to be they were kind of separate, and sales trainers, like they do their own esoteric thing. Nobody really used sales training afterwards. It never got reinforced. I'm seeing now that the rev ops, the sales trainers, they're involved in our deal cycle. So we might go into enablement first, but then if there is a rev ops person, we have to bring them in. Sales leaders definitely, because what we have to show, kind of what you're saying, is a multi-tiered value system where it affects every single person. And if your strategy is to hire folks right out of college, well, then you need to get them on board quickly. You need them to give them the foundations of sales. How are you going to connect your sales training to your enablement, to your rev ops, so they're driving revenue, and what platforms you're going to do that to actually drive that strategy? So I guess a long way of saying I'm seeing them coming closer together, and the platform that this person adopts are ultimately affecting the outcomes of the other person.
I completely agree with you, but I also think RevOps will be the thread between all of the different functions of the business. So we can say this about sales as well, but I also do think it's going to be, the entire go-to-market team is going to be interweaved with RevOps as almost, I think, the Robin to Batman, if the Batman's CEO, right? I mean, if that makes sense, right? So like RevOps will be close to C-suite and kind of almost weaving and intertwining everything to do with the go-to-market together. I think that's where we're headed.
It's a good point, because now, let me amend part of that answer. So you said it, you're right, because if ultimately every company's becoming more sophisticated of what they're spending money on, right? What are we spending money on? What's the result of this money? And is ultimately helping drive our initiatives from the business level. That's ultimately RevOps' job to some degree, specifically within a sales framework. And you're right, they would be the ones kind of connecting all these dots and helping make sure the factory is running smoothly.
Craig, they were all of the questions that I had for you today. I really appreciate you coming on the show and chatting to me. For anyone that wants more information about Quantified, Craig wants to reach out. We'll have a bunch of resources and links and other bits and bobs down below wherever you're watching or listening to this episode. Before we wrap up, Craig, is there anything that you want to leave the audience, whether they're a sales leader, CEO, founder, salesperson, leave the audience with?
I think it's actually what I said earlier, and I think it's important to always remember for myself with motivation that sales is an art. It's like any other art. I play music, and in music, you have to prepare, you've got to memorize, you got to practice, you got to get into your motor skills. But at some point, we have to release that and let the spontaneity of creativity enter, so that we can be really truly effective to the moment. And I meditate as well. So that's like all these things connect, and sales it's a beautiful, beautiful thing if we can stay focused in what it is. It can be very challenging if not. So if anybody out there listening, just keep that in mind when things get really rough, that this really is a beautiful art that will teach us how to evolve as human beings. And we need salespeople. We're always going to need salespeople. No AI is going to replace us, at least not in my lifetime, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully not. Amazing, Craig. Thanks so much for joining me, and for all of those listening, we'll see you next week. Cheers.
Take care.